You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 21st of March 2025 on Monocle Radio.
Heathrow Airport, even more annoying than usual. French winemakers brace for Trump's tariffs, and the exhibition celebrating a long-overlooked aspect of Paris's art heritage. I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at 16 Rue Bachemont in Paris. I'm Andrew Muller. It's Friday, so it's our weekly in-house daily, and the current and former Monocle staff piling in on this historic link-up of our European studios in Paris, London and Zürich are Daphnée Denis, Simon Bouvier, Laurent Ribera, Josh Fehnert and Désirée Bandli. They'll discuss the day's stuff, plus we'll have the latest on today's shutdown of Heathrow Airport and our weekly assessment of what we've learned. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller, and though we are in Paris, we're going to start in London, specifically at Heathrow Airport, and a big hello to anyone tuning in as a means of passing 40 minutes of the still unspecified wait until their replacement flight. Europe's busiest airport has been closed all day after a fire at an electricity substation late last night left the airport and many homes in the vicinity without power. The latest is that flights have restarted, but passengers remain advised not to go to Heathrow until or unless airlines tell them to. Well, I'm joined first of all by Dr Sally Leivesley, Managing Director of New Risk Limited. Sally advises companies and governments on terrorism. Sally, first of all, is it clear yet what caused this? So far, authorities are sort of tending away from any hint that it might actually have been sabotage.
I would think that a very open mind is being kept until the forensics from the fire investigation are in. But as forensics can take a while, I would be extremely surprised if a lot of countries in Europe, as well as hopefully in the UK, are not looking at additional protection of their energy systems, and particularly the configuration of substations that are close to critical infrastructure.
Well, because on that thought, I mean, whether it was accident, sabotage or whatever, this didn't look like an especially big or dramatic fire. Is it weird that something as important as Heathrow Airport is this vulnerable?
Oh, Andrew, I've had a lot to do with fires. I was a fire commissioner appointed to review the fire services in Australia many years ago. And that seemed to me to be a significant fire with very fast fire growth, which sometimes happens if you might have an explosive device or an incendiary device put into a structure. So that particular fire grew very fast. We have been told that a backup system was also involved in the fire, and the impact on Heathrow was immediate.
So will this be prompting an amount of nervous conversations at airports, well, basically everywhere?
It's not just airports. It's got a much wider risk, particularly as Europe is slightly nervous at the moment and having a lot of defence meetings, because these types of catastrophic events that happen in countries that are away from the frontline conflict with Ukraine, but where the emphasis in the attacks on Ukraine is very much to take out the energy infrastructure. So I would consider that the lessons that will be taken is whether energy infrastructure, including older energy infrastructure, can be subject to physical devices or to cyber attacks to actually disable them. You will remember in the early days before Ukraine, years before Ukraine was invaded, there was the West Ukraine grid incident, which was a cyber attack. And then there were subsequent incidents which were testing the actual strength of the recovery capability in Ukraine. So other countries now will be very concerned.
How much better have people got at protecting critical infrastructure, though? Because presumably there is ultimately only so much that can be done.
There's a difference in generic protection of infrastructure and looking at key points. And if we look, this incident's got a lot of similarities in my mind when I'm looking at war and sabotage as separate to terrorism, because it is very similar to day one of the Paris Olympics, where the critical points of the high-speed trains were taken out simultaneously, and you had 800,000 people without transport. It causes maximum embarrassment to the political leadership and a lot of disruption. This incident in Heathrow will cause a rift between Heathrow, UK, and the European countries, because Heathrow is a hub not only for passengers but also for freight. So there will be blame and anger, and inside the UK there will be blame and anger. And in a lead up to conflict, this is what countries will expect if critical infrastructure is successfully attacked.
Dr Sally Leivesley at New Risk Limited, thank you for joining us. We will, of course, have more on that story across all our shows this weekend. You are listening to The Daily on Monocle Radio, live from Paris, and I'm joined now for the rest of this show by Monocle's Paris Bureau Chief Simon Bouvier, by the journalist, filmmaker, editor-in-chief of Tracks on Arte, and Monocle friend Daphnée Denis. And also joining us for this opening segment is Lorian Ribera, manager of Monocle's new Paris shop and cafe, and back in London is Monocle's editor Josh Fehnert. Let's see if we can keep all this going in the right direction. Hello, everybody.
Bonsoir. How's it going, Andrew?
It's going very well, I think, but I think a lot of the credit for that is due Lorian and the team here. I've been here 2 days now, and I'm not just saying this because I work for Monocle. This is a fabulous setup that you've put together here.
Thank you, Andrew. I don't have anything to do with the radio, but the rest of the cafe and the shop was great work that we and the team from Paris, the architect from Cannes Design that you receive also on the show this week, we just put every effort we had together, and it's just a great result. And we had our opening party 2 days ago, which was a success also. So
absolutely packed and spilled out onto the street. I think the latest word was 250 or something guests over the course of the evening. So incredible turnout.
And just before we bring in the other guests as well, Lorian, obviously the best way for people to experience the shop and cafe here is to come and visit it. But before they do, what should people expect when they get here? Introduce the space to our listeners, if you would.
Yeah, if you haven't been in the Paris Cafe yet, first time you will coming, you will see like few spot on the terrace. We have 6 outdoor seats, which is quite nice in Paris because it can be really tiny sometimes. And when you enter, you have the counter, but also our Monocle kiosk with all of the books and newspaper that we produce, but also some local newspaper from Germany, Switzerland, French, and also the independent magazine like Brutus, Cabana, those kind of stuff that you will like to find in our kiosk. You can obviously order a great specialty coffee, have a bite for lunch or dinner. We offer also aperitivo in the evening, so you can test our wine list and cocktail list. And in the back of the shop, after all the seated table, you will find the retail section, which we sell our product, the brand that we like. Could be Japanese product, English product, Swedish product also. So we just love having like travel, homeware, and those kind of product that we love to provide our customer.
Well, I can absolutely vouch for the bacon sandwiches as of this lunchtime. But while we're talking about new Monocle stuff, I'll bring in Josh Fehnert from our studio in London. Josh is the editor of Monocle. And Josh, there is a new issue imminent.
There is, but I only really want to hear about these bacon sandwiches, Andrew. I didn't try them when I attended the opening event. I'm guessing it's on a kind of sliced white bread with a bit of brown sauce. Is it the Monocle way?
Not as such, no, but they are nevertheless excellent. But Josh, to the magazine, which I assume you have a copy of there because we have copies here, I think. What is there a theme this month?
You've not seen the cover, I can tell that, Andrew. It is the style theme this month, and Style cuts across everything that we do in Monocle. We think how and where things are made is important. We think it's important to make an effort, whether you are off to Monocle's shop opening, whether you're turning up to work, you're at the beginning of the career, or you're at the end of your career. Really, Lauriane's work, and then you see how well turned out the cafe staff are, and I'm sure Simon's there in a three-piece suit as well. Style is important to Monocle, but it's not down to the trends always. It's also about the industries that keep things moving around the world, and so that's the departure point for a great issue of the magazine. And did you have any favourite topics, Andrew? I know you read from cover to cover.
Obviously, I start with the style section, Josh, and I got my spats back from the cleaners just for the shows in Paris. But you were here earlier in the week. Tell us if you can recall anything of the opening night party. What do you actually recall?
If I told you I spent much of the night on the street, that might sound different from what I actually mean, but there was a great moment after some of the guests started leaving. There were people, smoking enthusiastically, clinking glasses of champagne, and kind of smiling as they blocked the road because there just wasn't room to move. And it just made me think, we're not a French language publication, and yet we've managed to attract this excitement about, an English language brand being there. And, our editorial director, Tyler Brulé, made the point the following day: if we'd have tried this in Zurich, we'd be in prison. We'd be in jail. And there was just some excellent Gallic insouciance to what went on. It was a party. People were enjoying themselves. And you know what? People were dressed up for it. And, they could have all been in the style issue of Monocle.
Well, on the subject of Gallic insouciance, I will introduce our final guest this evening. This is Daphnée Denis, who used to work for Monocle and now doesn't anymore. But you join us here actually from the United Kingdom as such. What were you doing, Daphnée, on the Isle of Skye?
Oh, yes, indeed, yes. I was reporting a story about an arts collective called Cooking Sections, who are working on imagining a better nutrition for the future in a project called Climavore that is encouraging us to divest from salmon farming through the arts. They've been exhibited at Tate, they've been acquired by Tate, and lots of other galleries, museums, etc. They're fantastic. You should check them out.
I should. Well, any excuse to go to the Isle of Skye I would jump at. Was it your first time there?
It was indeed. And
what did you think?
I thought it was absolutely stunning and very cold.
Because I haven't been to the Isle of Skye for about 30 years when I was sent there by a music magazine to review a show by the Proclaimers.
Pretty much like me. I was sent there by a cultural TV show.
The audience of which remains, I think, the drunkest assembly of human beings I have ever seen in my life. But then I wasn't at the launch party here on Wednesday night. Josh, just coming back to the current issue of Monocle, aside from the style stuff, what else can readers look forward to?
Oh, there's so much. I'd take up the whole show. I'll give you just a couple of very, very brief highlights. We did a great report on the canine TSA unit, which is a story about security in airports, obviously, given the top of the show and Dr Sally Leivesley's input, something that we're all talking and thinking about. But I think in light of Trump's offer to, tighten up the borders as well. Security takes on sometimes a protective tone and sometimes a menacing tone. And I think our access there and the access to some pretty cute dogs it is a great story that hits on a couple of levels. We sent our Istanbul correspondent to Syria, unprecedented access to some of the Turkish firms looking to secure the contracts for rebuilding. So again, the world is looking at a country in a very difficult spot, wondering whether its leader will aspire to be a benevolent member of the international community. There's also a business story there, and we shouldn't be afraid of telling that and understanding that. And the very final plug I'll give is to the essay section. We've turned this into a bit of a mainstay. We're trying to do some longer reads as well. And there's a great essay by the writer Tom Vanderbilt, based in the US. And it's about how people walk much quicker in cities nowadays. They discovered some footage of people in the 80s walking through Bryant Park, and they were able to do a study about how quickly people were moving, what their interactions were like. And shock horror, we spend a lot of time looking at our phones, not making eye contact with each other. And we don't really stop in the street and talk to each other very much. So an interesting study. And I think in those three stories, something for the dog lover, something for the fast walker, and something for the Turkish property prospector. So what more do you need?
Well, we are going to cross now to our Zurich studio at Duferstrasse 90. We're going to try and keep 3 studios on the show at once. What could possibly go wrong? We're joined by Monocle's producer, Désirée Bandli. And Desi, there's a lot of stuff going on in Zurich. What is about to manifest?
Good evening. Yeah, there is actually a lot of stuff. So tomorrow we're going to have our yearly Hanami market, which is basically our finest selection of Japanese brands and food that we show in here and as well outside. So the Japanese lanterns have been hung, the tables are already here, they're already setting up. So yeah, we're ready to welcome our listeners.
And just to follow that up, Desi, it may not seem the most intuitive proposition, a Japanese market in Switzerland, but where does that idea come from?
I assume it comes from Tyler's love for Japan, and we do actually have 2 Japanese ladies working with us who also brought in a lot of their friends and fellow Japanese who always, there's a lot of quite big Japanese diaspora here, so there's quite a nice selection. So we've got food, we've got clothing made in Japan, we've got a lot of different ceramics you can buy. So yeah, quite a lot. I think we're talking about like 15 different stands, all Japanese owned.
And I'll bring in our Paris contingent here, Simon and Lorient. It's not like you've got enough to do as it is already, obviously, but are there discussions of Paris events? Will we be closing off the entire street at some point and taking it over?
Well, time will tell if we'll have a Paris Marché de Noël, as they call Christmas markets in French. But for now, unless I missed an episode, I don't think we have concrete plans, but you'll be the first to know as soon as those come to light, if they ever do.
Desi, it says here I'm supposed to ask you as well, and I think this is probably not a feature of the market, although do correct me, robot dogs at large in Bern. So
no, all we can offer here actually is Monocle. So okay. Nothing nearly as dangerous. So yeah, last week we had the first, I should say, outing of this so-called rubber dog in Bern. So what it is, it's the police of Bern, the canton of Bern, that apparently has had this dog, let's call it dog, for nearly a year. But last week, it was the first time it was seen outside. So basically what they do, they're kind of used to assess situations, I guess. So what happened was last week, they were looking for a man with a gun, which it wasn't there. But anyway, so they used this dog for the first time, and it created quite a few people were looking at it, let's say, a bit more critically than I think they thought.
Josh, I'm going to bring you in on this, and then I will put the similar question. I will put the similar question to Daphnée. But how do we think London would take to the idea of robot dogs being deployed by the Metropolitan Police? By which I guess I'm asking, how long before the robot dog ends up with its legs removed and upside down?
Yeah, I mean, it's a fair point. You know, would the dog be disgraced and attacked and discredited? I think in the sort of slightly permissive world that we live in, everyone's going to have a robot dog in 5 years. And if I attempt to, suggest to the owner that they might want to, clean up after it or it not maul my child, I would be the person who was in the wrong. So I can imagine a very bright future for the dog in lawless London.
I mean, Daphnée, can you imagine Paris's celebrated demonstrations being joined by robot police dogs?
No, I cannot imagine that. I think the dog wouldn't last a second. We have a history of an already conflictual relationship with human cops, so I don't think the robots would fare very well.
Désirée in Zurich, I do just want to come back to you for one final plug for the market. When does it actually begin?
So we start tomorrow at 10 o'clock and we go till 7 at night.
So tomorrow from 10 till 7?
Yes.
And people can look us up. They know where to find us. We're easily findable in Zurich. Josh Fehnert in London, Désirée Bandli in Zurich. Thank you for joining us. You are listening to The Daily on Monocle Radio. And now there are many countries and many industries with a considerable stake in the threats of US President Donald Trump to tariff his country into becoming an insular autarky that makes North Korea look like Singapore. But from where we are presently broadcasting, there seems something especially emblematically alarming warning about Trump's threats to stick a 200% tariff on European alcohol exports. France sells 4 billion euros worth of wine and spirits to the US every year. The trade's French Federation estimates that this business would vanish in an instant. On the upside, the prospect of being condemned to Californian Zinfandel might be what rouses the American people to revolt. Simon, how serious and widespread is the panic on this? Because 4 billion euros worth of business disappearing overnight, which is what the Federation is warning is going to happen, is considerable.
Yes, that's right. I think the French wine producers and cognac producers are quite frustrated because they were already on the receiving end of trade tit for tat under the first Trump administration, when at the time what was being discussed were 25% tariffs on French wines. And this time it's 200%, as you said. So that's essentially an embargo on American imports of French wines. And so I think the accurate description for how they're feeling right now is disbelief and panic, because unless some negotiated solution can be found, apparently the White House refuses to even discuss or sit down at the table with the Europeans to talk business until they reveal the full package of European tariffs that they want to impose. The date set for that is April 2nd. But after that, they'll have a couple of weeks to try and settle things. But otherwise, this really big business is going to be in a lot of trouble. And they're not the only ones in the EU, you know. France is the biggest exporter to the US with 4 billion, but Italy also exports $2 billion, or 2 billion euros, worth of wine to the US.
Lauriane, can businesses like this, the one we're sitting in, at least perhaps hope that French people will feel patriotically obliged to drink more French wine?
Does French people need a good excuse, you think? I'm not sure it will change the French market, the way we consume wine, for sure. But I'm sure that American people will be glad to have a French glass of wine every time they can in Paris next time.
I mean, Daphnée, are you seeing, generally this is a thing descending not just upon France but upon Europe more generally, the idea that the United States is not what we have spent the entire post-World War II period assuming it is?
I think some people are realizing that. How would I put it? I think there's a level of disbelief as to what's going on in the United States, and then other people who say he's just saying out loud what they've thought about for a long time. I do think, though, when it comes to wine and spirits and champagne, some people are still going to want their champagne. Some people in the US, for instance, I don't see bubbly from California replacing champagne. I don't see that happening. So I don't know how much he's bluffing, but I hope there will be a solution found.
I mean, Simon, President Trump did at one point make a reference. He said it would be good news for, as he put it, the American champagne business. And I'm kind of surprised and disappointed that France didn't recall its ambassador over that alone.
That very turn of phrase.
Well, exactly. But is it possible, do you think, that he's kind of instinctively understood how to hit France where it hurts? Because the money and the numbers here are significant, but there is something symbolic about this, right? This is one of the things that France is famous for.
I think that it shows that there's a method to what they're doing with these, and in President Trump's words, reciprocal tariffs. It might seem crazy, but there is a very specific, deliberate method to it. For example, the reason that the threat of these tariffs is being waved around by the White House is that the EU, in retaliation for American tariffs that are currently in place of 25% on imports of steel and aluminum from Europe, imposed a tariff of 50% on whiskey and bourbon from the United States. And Brussels thought they were being very smart because they were hitting Trump where it hurt him, not necessarily economically, but politically, in states, Tennessee and Kentucky, that are solidly Republican, and hoping to kind of erode support for him in key constituencies. But Trump says, you know what? I can play that game too. I can divide European Union that is kind of rhetorically united behind this retaliating against American tariffs. I can target industries that are very big in specific countries and watch this kind of unity suddenly dissolve as French producers say, well, you need to go lobby on our behalf to get this tariff that targets us specifically lifted. They know exactly what they're doing with this, and they're looking to divide Europeans.
Well, let's look now at a particular event in Paris, and there was already a certain urgency about visiting the Pompidou Centre. The famous inside-out art space will close in September for an overhaul expected to take at least 5 years. Extra impetus has been lent, however, by the last major exhibition it will host before the renovators move in. Paris Noir celebrates the black artists who came to Paris from Francophone Africa, the United States and elsewhere, seeking freedom and encouragement which had been lacking at home. Daphnée, you have the advantage of having been to this exhibition. I have not, but we'll try to get along tomorrow. Just reading about it, this does seem like one of those things where you think it's quite weird that this hasn't been done before.
Very much so. And if you talk to the curators, Alicia Nog and her co-curator, Eva Boiroy de Gaëvel, that is very much the point. Pompidou opened with 3 groundbreaking exhibitions that all had Paris in their name. Paris-Dakar, Paris-Moscou, and I forget the last one. But no, not Paris-Dakar, obviously, Paris-Berlin. And Paris Noir was never part of it. The history of black artists who have worked in Paris have been largely overlooked. And it's an overwhelming exhibition of 150 artists, more than 400 works that we should know and that we don't know. So it's quite an upsetting exhibition in the sense that we feel like there's a lot that hasn't been told and that there's a lot more to tell, which even the curators say themselves.
But is it clear, to follow that up, why that story hasn't been told? Because reading around the stories of some of these artists, a lot of them came here because they thought they could accomplish things in Paris that they couldn't at home. A lot of them have said they were actually quite encouraged in Paris and they were able to fulfill their artistic vision. It seems strange that they were then sort of written out of the story of Parisian art.
I think it depends. I think when it comes to African-American artists, it may have been the case, but at the same time, there's lots of people from the Caribbean, from the Antilles, Martinique, from the African continent that just happened to be there and that didn't come to Paris necessarily for that. But, some of them came to, for instance, explore abstraction or surrealism or abstract expressionism, which was very tied to white artists in the US. But in France was, something that black artists could develop as something of their own. And there's an interesting story with that because abstract expressionism comes from jazz and comes from black music, but was claimed a lot in the US by white artists. And so Paris became a place where this became possible. And it's the case with loads of different artists who also met each other, were from lots of different places. I'm thinking of Wilfredo Lam, for instance, Cuban. There's so many names, it's really hard to remember them all. But all of these people talked with one another and sort of had an interesting vision of decolonial thought, which has also not really been explored or not as much as it should have been.
I mean, does this idea of Paris still really exist now, Lo? Like, Lauriane, you are now running a cafe. Since it's opened, have you seen any pale, consumptive, artistic types huddled in a corner, sketching intently?
Not in this cafe, but most in French brasserie. You can find people just sitting all day, mostly art student right now. But if you go to Montmartre, of course, you will find this sketch portrait guy that will just draw everyone's in Paris, which are quite nice. So it depends where you are, I think.
I mean, Simone, what do you think? Because it's a conversation I know occurs a lot in London, which for centuries has had this reputation of being a great creative hub. But in recent years, there's concern that the kind of people who would have once have come to London to try their luck have been completely priced out of it. Does Paris have the same problem?
Well, I think it's interesting because there are parallel dynamics of more and more people from abroad coming to Paris, not just to visit it, but to call it home, and creative people because of all of the economic dynamism in the creative field that we have going on here, especially in fashion, but also, the arts is a world that is increasingly connected to it. So that's one thing. And then I think there's also, which makes this exhibition particularly fascinating, and I haven't seen it yet, but I'd also love to go see it. There's this high-level ideal of Republican, with a small r, colorblindness in France that has meant that we don't necessarily have the respect for the role of identity in how it influences art that you have in other countries. It's still forbidden by the law to create, in the census, for instance, it's not allowed to categorize people based on their origins or their ethnicity the way that it is in the United States. And I think that's emblematic of a culture that, even in the government, that has a problem accepting that it is not colorblind. Recognition of institutional racism on part of the state. For example, it took until Jacques Chirac's presidency for the French government to apologize in its role in the deportation of Jews, and President Macron. And this was controversial even in the 2020s, to recognize that there had been abuses by the French army in Algeria during that country's war of independence. I mean, it's so far down the road, but yet the government still had a policy of, we do not admit to having any responsibility in this. I think that is something that is changing in civil society and in the artistic field, but it's something that this culture makes it more difficult for these conversations to happen, I think.
Well, just as a final thought then, Daphnée, is that a partial explanation for why these artists have been written out of Paris's artistic story? Too much égalité by half, perhaps?
Yeah, I think there's been definitely a hesitation to categorize this as a movement. There's many movements that met in Paris, but there is a literary movement called La Négritude, which has been recognized, which came from the Antilles. But exploring whether this happened in the arts, in painting or in sculpture, etc., was completely overlooked to celebrate Paris as the city of the surrealists, the cubists, the city of Picasso, the city of midnight in Paris, which is very, very white. But that is not the truth. And I think it's obviously it's a political and a structural thing. It's what you were saying. Of course, there is structural racism in the institutions that have really struggled to recognize this, and still really struggle today to recognize the fact that they need to catch up and they need to be present, and that it's not an excuse, that identity is not just an excuse to talk about artists. It's really something that powers their art, and that we need to think about and look into.
That's Paris Noir at the Pompidou Centre. Daphnée Denis, Laurent Ribera and Simon Bouvier, thank you for joining us. Finally, on today's show, our weekly assessment of how much the wiser we are for the last 7 days. And there is a definite French theme this week. You see how meticulously stitched together this all is. We learned this week that the hammer of justice had descended in the matter of the Crown versus those blokes who stole that solid gold toilet.
I can't wait to see where this goes.
Okay. Tell me more.
Let's see where this goes.
Come on, you remember. 5 years back, give or take, a solid gold toilet was stolen from Blenheim Palace, where it had been part of some doubtless non-terrible and non-risible art exhibition. Police initially had nothing to go on, but eventually flushed the suspects out. And the fact of their conviction tees up nicely. We learned a segue about sticking with the subject of people who may have acquired gilt-finished bathroom fixtures by dubiously ethical means because... We learned that US President Donald Trump and or certain members of his administration lack both a basic understanding of the history of their own nation and an elementary appreciation of the sensitivities of other nations. We were, yes, every bit as shocked as you are. We learned this from President Trump's incumbent spokesnitwit Caroline Leavitt, whose lines in response to a question about some French politician wanting the Statue of Liberty returned, all things considered, were apparently supplied by writers previously retained by mid-1970s English supper club comedians and or mid-1980s English football hooligans.
My advice to that unnamed low-level French politician would be to remind them that it's only because of the United States of America that the French are not speaking German right now. So they should be very grateful to our great country.
Go on, you know you want to.
Non mais c'est n'importe quoi. Non mais ils se prennent pour qui ces Américains? La Statue de Liberté, c'est quoi ce manque de culture? C'est le monde à l'envers.
And we couldn't agree more. We learned, therefore, that Leavitt has never wondered why the park out the front of the white actual house is named after someone called Lafayette. If she had, she might have learned that the American Revolution was to a considerable extent a French endeavour, that French troops fought on land and at sea alongside the forces of the fledgling United States, and that indeed at the climactic and conclusive battles of the Chesapeake and of Yorktown, decisive contributions were made by a French fleet commanded by the Comte de Grasse, French troops commanded by the Comte de Rochambeau, and the Light Division of the American Army commanded by one Major Marie-Joseph Paul-Yves Roche-Gilbert du Motier, a.k.a. the Marquis de Lafayette, who was, can we shock you, French, and after whom that park out the front of the white actual house is named. It is probably fairer to say that if it wasn't for the French, Americans might yet be speaking English, instead of whatever this is.
And you're in the boat, and you have this tremendously powerful battery, and the battery's now underwater, and there's a shark that's approximately 10 yards over there. By the way, a lot of shark attacks lately. Do you notice that? A lot of shark. I watched some guys justifying it today. Well, they weren't really that angry. They bit off the young lady's leg because of the fact that they were not hungry, but they misunderstood who she was. These people are crazy. He said there's no problem with sharks. They just didn't really understand a young woman swimming now really got decimated, and other people too, a lot of shark attacks. So I said, so there's a shark 10 yards away from the boat, 10 yards. Do I get electrocuted?
And still be subject to the whims and caprices of a mad king who believes himself above the law. Imagine that. Wouldn't it be awful? But we learned that ongoing reassessments of American history were redounding to the disfavour not only of America's allies, but America's own troops. For we learned that the US Department of Defense, under the sane and normal overwatch of this guy...
Make no mistake, President Trump will not allow anyone to turn Uncle Sam into Uncle Sucker.
i.e. Secretary of Defense and former Fox News host Pete Hegseth, had begun removing from the DoD website pages honouring certain US military veterans, and that for the benefit of listeners who may not yet have guessed what they all have in common, they include Major General Charles Calvin Rogers of the US Army, the highest-ranking black soldier to have won the Congressional Medal of Honor, which he received for undertaking during one battle in the Vietnam War, absolutely the kind of heroics you can very certainly imagine a younger Donald Trump performing, had he not been precluded from serving his country in that conflict by the profoundly cruel and deeply imaginary affliction of bone spurs. Among those also whisked from the DoD site were the Navajo code talkers, i.e. those Native American service personnel who flummoxed Japanese eavesdroppers in the Pacific theatre of World War II to crucial effect by communicating in a language not widely spoken by the United States' Japanese adversary. In these and several other instances, we learned that the URL of the removed pages was affixed with the taunt DEI, an acronym representing diversity, equity and inclusion, a concept upon which Trump and his cohort are fixated for some altogether unimaginable reason. We had previously learned, indeed, Bit of an 80s new romantic theme this week. Nice. We had previously learned, indeed, that so rigorous was this purge of all things D, E, or indeed I, that it had also come for the B-29 bomber, which delivered a crucial blow to Japan on the grounds that its pilot, Colonel Paul Tibbets, named the aircraft bearing the first atomic bomb to be dropped in wartime after his mother, whose name was Enola Gay. We're not making this up.
Looking into a story getting a lot of buzz on social media. It claims the Trump administration has marked a photo of the Enola Gay for deletion from the Pentagon's website as part of its DEI purge, and this one is apparently true.
So we would appear to have learned that bombing the cities of America's enemies is now unacceptably woke. There really is no pleasing some people. And that is all for this edition of the Monocle Daily live from Paris. A big thanks to our panellists today, Simon Bouvier, Daphnée Denis, Lorient Ribera, Josh Fehnert and Désirée Bandli. Thanks also to Sally Leivesley at the top of the show. The show was produced by Chris Chermak and researched by Francesca Jilks. Our sound engineer was Steph Chungu. I'm Andrew Muller here in Paris. The Daily is back at the same time on Monday. Thanks for listening.